Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you happenstance in this Truth Bomb riff. It is my great pleasure to introduce back to you, I'd say a regular on my discussions here on Patrick Level Truth Bombs, the con, my friend from the Great White North, a gentleman by the name of Regan Boychuk. And we're recording on Friday, August 1st, 2025, approximately 10 a.m. my time. And my friend Regan comes from Alberta, Canada. And before we start to roll into this, I just want to um, apologize first that we haven't recorded more often. I want to get this like pretty consistent because I think the information that you have is blockbuster in so many ways. Two, you're so intriguing because you're from Canada, and in context to the magnitude of what's happening in the United States by way of the tariffs and what's happening with global trade and markets this morning, roiling in your expertise in economics and journalism, you bring a ton of perspective that want the people we're broadening our scope and information to be able to understand, because we're providing mostly information that people just don't have access to or context of. But before we get into it, or maybe this is the way we're going to get into it, a lot of what's in my bandwidth at the moment is all stemming from all things Epstein, because Epstein is obviously devouring the news cycle, devouring online algorithms, everything that's out there, and justifiably so because of just the intrigue of the story, how it relates to Trump, the fracturing of MAGA in the United States based on, let's say the first step, the second step, the third step, and on up, depending on where you come in and what your level of sophistication is. But right before I hit record on this or sent you a link, Reagan, I was listening to Whitney Webb, and she was being interviewed by Brianna Joy Gray, somebody who I lost respect for a long time ago, but at the same time recognized as one of the smartest, let's say, independent podcasters in the United States. Brianna Joy Gray worked on the Bernie campaigns for years. She is JD from Harvard. She's incredibly sophisticated and smart. But I'd been trying to feed her the information that, of course, you and I understand and what you've intersected with, and she's ignored forever, which I find absolutely preposterous and just ridiculous, all things considered. So I stopped following Brianna Joy Gray over a year ago, probably. And either they took me off of the algorithm or the algorithm itself took me off of getting notifications from her podcast, or maybe she was in some manner, shape, or form quashed for whatever reason. But I found it intriguing that she just happened to pop up on my feed recently because probably I'm in this incredibly uh, significant algorithm feed of all things Epstein that I'm following, that I'm reading, I'm responding to, that I'm interacting with. In fact, I just happened to interview Lev Parnas the other day, and he's kind of a conduit to a lot of guys, both inside Israel as well as Russia, with a lot of really intriguing uh, connections to all things international mob. Let's put it that way, right? That have information, and it is really incredible. But to start us off, I want to just mention a couple of things about this interaction between Whitney Webb and Brianna Joy Gray. First and foremost, if you know who Whitney Webb is, she's been doing some pretty significant forensic auditing of all things, shall we say, organized crime over the years, a historical context that goes back to the years of prohibition, quite frankly, which connects our two countries, which actually connects somebody that was an executive producer of mine that happens to be from one of the wealthiest families stemming from Canada, the Canadian branch, but they were all into bootlegging. They were all into basically, their empire was built during American Prohibition. And at that time period, there was a lot of organized crime. There was a lot of, let's say, phase one of this era's version of what would become Epstein downstream, i.e., using blackmail and sophisticated rings of getting important people in vulnerable positions so that they could use them to further their ambitions, whatever that may be, right? Whether it was to keep certain people out of jail, whether it was to get legislation that would be approved that would ultimately legalize, liquor. I can't remember what the exact amendment was, but the nature of all of that grift was always connected to organized crime, gambling, money laundering, sophisticated things that could be involved with gun smuggling and running sorts of things that I would constitute is the economy that's always been part of the global economy, just the nature of humanity, the dark economy, right? All of those things from prostitution, illicit drug use, on down the scenarios. But there was always a connection between what we might call the mainstream economy and then the dark economy. And what Epstein had revealed and what I had learned over the course of many years, particularly because of our work, the con, that would lead me to incredible work from the ICIJ, the international ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, of which one of the main journalists who provided profound work for the con, a gentleman by the name of Michael Hudson. He was one of the key figures of this. And these guys did, like, for example, the Panama Papers. They've been revealing all sorts of international laundering for now over a decade. And they've mysteriously kind of been quashed as well from my feed recently, which I find interesting. Anyway, the story of Whitney Webb, from that perspective, from 30s bootlegging all the way through the CIA construct, a lot of this dealing with organized crime, Italian mob, Jewish mob, a connection there, the state of Israel, and all of these things, global finance. And one of the things, and I'm going to add two anecdotes here that I thought were hilarious, as it relates to the Epstein list, or let's say a black book that supposedly came into being, that's kind of this tell-all of all of the people they had information on, potentially, and they just referred to it as a black book. This actually shocked me. Whitney Webb proclaimed that Courtney Love was on the list. I don't know if you know who Courtney Love is, but she was the wife of course, frontman of Nirvana, Kurt Cobain. And a lot of people think that she may have had something to do with Kurt Cobain's death. Okay, whatever. If you know who Courtney Love is, she was just a shit show train wreck of heroin addiction and all sorts of problems. But yet she could kind of walk in between getting back into the mainstream and back and forth. So very intriguing character. But the reason why she was brought up in this dialogue was her father was a road manager for the Grateful Dead. Now, the Grateful Dead supposedly were connected, and I've heard rumors of this throughout the time, and she just did this as a sidebar anecdote, but this shows you how deeply intrinsic some of this stuff might happen between, let's say, the economy and the light and the dark economy. So back during the 60s, during all of that mayhem that was taking place that would lead, of course, to the assassinations of MLK Jr., RFK, JFK at the beginning of the whole thing, and we've always been suspicious of CIA and FBI, right? But as it relates to the Grateful Dead, the nature and the magnitude of their relationship to all things, I'm thinking of what it came out of Stanford. In fact, there was a documentary recently on Netflix that exposed some of this as it related to, Helter Skelter. Remind me of the Jim Moore, not, what is Helter Skelter's real name? Why can't I think of his name? Swastika.
I know.
Huh?
Charles Manson.
Charles Manson. My mind's flooded with so many things. I couldn't think of Charles Manson's name for a second because I'm thinking of this. Was it Project Ultra from the CIA? They were dosing San Francisco. They were using these psychology experiments where they were able to get everybody tweaked on all sorts of psilocybin. And obviously that was kind of stemming from the Grateful Dead movement, but they were using that, infiltrating it in a number of ways, using it as experiments on, I think, control of the masses, quite frankly. That's, that was at that really chaotic time period, the late 60s, early 70s. And I think it was Project Ultra. But anyway, so she made that connection. I'm thinking about all of these things, and it seems disparate, right? But yet it's not. If you look at the chronology of all of these elements, and you think of, okay, chaos, control, chaos, control, chaos, control. And if you know anything about intelligence, particularly the CIA and the KGB, their entire apparatus is to create chaos to foment control, right? And they do it by any means necessary, particularly the dark market, the black arts of getting people blackmailed, using drugs and prostitution and all of these things to be able to get people in positions of power obviously to do their bidding. Okay, so that's just kind of a mosaic of all of these things. And now finally people are asking questions, right? Okay, who was Les Wexner? Why is $1.5 billion missing? How many hundreds of billions of dollars were laundered through Deutsche Bank? What is the relationship between Trump and Putin? So it seems disparate, but it's not. This is just the way things have been working. And I'll add this one last piece. The FinCEN files 2 years ago from the ICIJ had revealed that literally there were millions of suspicious activity reports that were not provided from the banks, that were reported to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice of the United States did nothing. And so then we find out that Chase, Bank of America, the country's largest hedge funds, and private equity funds were all engaged in some manner, shape, or form with providing money to whatever this Epstein scenario was. Okay. So as above, as below, and this is one podcaster recently said, and this is the jumping off point. Look, what everybody's missing with regards to Epstein is that's just literally the tip of the iceberg in terms of global money laundering, the access to Fed funds and bailouts. So there's this constant sort of the way capitalism is structured, supposedly, is every 7 years you're going to have up and down cycles, right? But what we've seen in the pattern is it's massive criminality, massive racketeering, dark arts type of stuff that ultimately manifests in the stuff that we showed through control fraud. And the entire financial system's in on it. And then all of a sudden, it collapses. And then the full faith and credit of the United States is there to bail that system out without any regulatory adjudication slash consequence for the racketeering that manifests this whole thing. And as you start to see the clouds start to dissipate, it's impossible not to see the shadow sector of power, which is what you've been talking about, from monarchies, kings, control of territory, global markets, and the shadow arts, not to mention on top of economics. So let it rip, man. I think I went for 15, 20 minutes. It's your turn. Go for it.
Well, I think you're right. I think there's disturbing parallels between what we know about the mafia and the history of that, what we see unfolding today, and Epstein is horrific. That's perfectly true. It's also true. It's old news. We're talking about old days. We're talking about Democratic presidents decades ago. The reason everybody's talking about is because the system is falling apart. Things are coming so fast. There's so much going on. There's so much bad things happening, cooking. This is a distraction. In the 90s, the Pentagon, McKinley advised the Pentagon about the internet and freedom of information, the threats that could pose, and they recommended stir up old controversies like JFK. You should keep dribbling out information to keep concerned citizens involved, engaged. That's a good strategy, and that's obviously been adopted by Trump. One of the first things he did was release files, promise more. It's been a game and a distraction while he's endlessly remaking the entire world. It's dangerous to be an enemy of the US and fatal to be an ally. And it is disturbing and disorientating to find out there's no rule of law. And what do? Everything you thought doesn't work the way you thought it did. The avenues of reform don't lead anywhere. And I live in a colony. Canada was a British colony. Some people think we were somehow independent at some point. I don't understand any serious argument for that. But before World War II, we were transferred to the Americans. And so studying Alberta, studying all the oil we have, all the money coming out of the ground, we don't get it. It doesn't make any sense. It all goes to foreigners. Nobody notices, nobody minds. But that's the real world. Whether you like it or whether you see it on the news or not, there's trillions of dollars missing here in Alberta. I'm the only one who will say it, argue it. No one can challenge it. It's a fact. And Epstein reveals a number of those sort of facts that are very disturbing, very hard to fit into your worldview. But a longer term perspective on the rule of law, it's a pretty recent thing, pretty rare thing around the world, fleeting. And we don't have it here in Canada, and it's falling apart other places. Um, and it it leaves us.
It's overwhelming, but let's start with a couple of these things. And I know that you're an incredible. First of all, us talk about the statement that the rule of law is negligible. So what we're now seeing, at least addressed by many podcasters, and every once in a while in mainstream news, you'll see this kind of trickle down that yes, of course, there's two versions of the law for everyone below the line, and then for that minute group here, nothing but cloudiness, and they're above the law. As in,
And you and me, we know which group we're in.
right, of
We're
course.
in that big group subject to the rule of law. And it's about to get vicious. It's been automated. So there's no more empathy or human to talk to. It's going to crush little
And the
people.
and the fakery and the fuckery of AI and all of the fake
Absolutely.
accounts and all of those things that and people can't keep up. Literally, I mean, I find myself I'm pretty quick, honestly, in terms of being able to absorb and discern and kind of put into different sorts of buckets the different sorts of scenarios that I could speak to directly. But what you and I understand is the paradigm, right? And so where we come from in terms of what we fully understand is because your incredible work that has been quashed by a lot of people that you would think would be allies, people that, let's put it this way, you and I are progressive. We're people that believe in the rule of law. We believe in rights for really everyone, but particularly this construct of the power of the workers, dignity and rights within the context of society, but also an understanding that, in my opinion, for example, the absurdity of this notion of globalism, right? I think that the mainstream, if, for example, I read a lot of the New York Times. I put my finger or my toe into Wall Street Journal on occasion. I typically read the mainstream newspapers that have been around forever: Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, Houston, that sort of thing, just to kind of see what they're saying. And then from there, I'll kind of observe mainstream media and all of its different sorts of echo chambers. But then the stuff that's happening online and what everybody is starting to do, what we've done a long time ago, right? Is because Epstein is forcing them to do this. Because, as you mentioned, Epstein was a story long ago. The stuff that mainstream media is addressing right now, literally, particularly not even giving a shit about the victims and ignoring them completely and ignoring their stories, had the FBI listened to what these targets are, the women that were victims of the Epstein scenario with Trump, and had they acted upon it decades ago, there's a good chance that they could have prevented everything that kind of went over the course of many, many years that it's hiding. Instead, Epstein ends up, dying in prison, either by his own hand or murdered, but there's obviously so many questions. But at the same time, these specific questions of who these women were, girls at the time, what they had, what Epstein had by way of evidence, and where the money came from. Suddenly, people are adding that up, right? And they're asking hard questions like, okay, well, wait a second. If a group of people can be above the law, and this is what's really kind of startled MAGA into its like Frankenstein reversal to Trump, right? And not being able to be controlled by Trump because they want the goods on what they think are the elites, right? The people that they wanted to purge out of Washington, the so-called swamp, right? But we all know that the king swamp rat is Donald Trump. How MAGA didn't know that, I have no idea. But in context to where we're coming from, right? The idea of no kings, the idea that, Alberta being independent, Canada, because of its history, obviously an extension of the crown of England and what that means by way of the monarchy and so on and so forth throughout the years. And where we've come together, where your recognition of the American sort of superpower was the law. and our ability to maintain the law to be able to purge the elite power construct so that they would not be the, what we rebelled against from the beginning, the tyranny. But what we're seeing, because the emperor's new clothes and the curtain being pulled back on Epstein, which is literally that big compared to what we're talking about, right? He's just an entry point. He's a gateway drug. And to reiterate, where we're coming from is pull back the illusion that there's independence of a rule of law that can hold power to account. That's all nonsense. That based on your query and how people think Alberta is independent, for example, given what you're talking about, particularly as it relates to your natural resources that are being extracted, being raped, being pillaged from your geographical presence, your statehood, your independence is all a facade because it's feeding this machine that bends the knee to this larger construct of tyranny that is obviously controlling the world. But everybody kind of knows that, but at the same time, they can't put their finger on who did what, when, and how it works, and how to stop it. So that being a construct for you, level anything that you feel we need to understand that from your work and who's hiding what for what purpose.
Well, the key point to to delineate who it is who doesn't apply to the law doesn't apply to them. Those are the dangerous people. Those are the people causing the havoc. And there's the mafia. For some reason, somehow, they're obviously above the law. They have great longevity, enormous crimes, and involve some sort of accommodation by the system. They're above the law. The mafia are just small-time imperialists. The kings and queens of the world have always been above the law. Every country in the world has had those two classes of people. There's the king and his friends who enjoy all they like and the law does not apply to them. And there's everybody else. That was the American ideal that created a system that would level it. We would have competition driving down costs, making things affordable, keeping you competitive, while equality before the law would ensure real competition and fairness. And that is a real recipe for success, unique in the world, a powerful example. But by World War II, the US had descended into an imperial presidency. With the absorption of Canada in 1938, before World War II, under your progressive FDR, whose uncle, the previous president, had led a vicious, explicit old-time imperial campaign across the world. His nephew in the 30s absorbed Canada and all of our oil. Before there was a CIA, the US installed the government in Alberta in 1935, wrote laws to make the oil industry above the law, gave away all of our oil for free to the Americans. And so these classes of people above the law and the rest of us, that's the problem in the world. Those are the troublemakers, and the rule of law is the solution to them. And the U.S. has the potential, has the law, has the infrastructure, has the capacity to go after those folks and to remove that lawless class that is destroying everything. But today, Epstein distraction isn't going to get us there. It is
But see, the irony,
disturbing.
though, is that Epstein also reveals the emperor's new clothes, to your point, right? Because, look, what we in our work have both extracted and exemplified and also projected, right, through our work in the con and ultimately in our collective conversations and so forth. But the elements of who did what, when, and how, and to expose the shadow corruption of the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world, which stems from where you and I intersect, right? Because you maintain that, and I don't know why my voice is going out, so pardon me as I work through it, but you maintain, and it makes all the sense in the world to me, was that Wall Street vis-a-vis the Rockefellers and their basically control of all of the future drilling rights and the capacity of the oil fields and the tar sands of Alberta were the future lending capacity of the United States that was, predicated before the Iraq War and the 20 years, of course, of what we've been involved with. But the way we were able to finance further based on the sort of global dominance of the US reserve currency as the world's reserve currency, and what that means in so many different things, is that we could borrow against future value of the tar sands capacity of what it would fuel in terms of global markets and so forth. And we could go into more of that detail, I think, later in the microeconomic analysis of it. But in terms of the law in the United States' position to be able to use the law to do what it has always intended by way of its institutions and the creation of those institutions and our entire system of professionals that can actually, through discovery and indictment process, take down racketeering. The laws exist infinitum to do that. But because of the what I'll refer to as the shadow corruption that we expose, that I've been trying to get everybody's attention about for now years, right? At least 6 years on this last version, 5 years since we released the con publicly. But right now, the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, most regulatory bodies in the United States are nakedly corrupt. And we can see that because of this monstrosity of Epstein. That's just, again, the very beginning to understand that the Attorney General of the United States will move heaven and hell to protect her king, Donald Trump, that the Supreme Court said is above the law in this imperial presidency, where, as we've demonstrated with the Clean New Deal, that not only is the president above the law, but the judiciary is above the law. The justices are above the law, particularly the SCOTUS justices, as well as the guns in terms of what we call qualified immunity. So if you've got a corporate fascist state that can control media and the ability of the American people to understand and discern that, no, there's two levels of justice, and not only that, that the economy is not the economy. Because what you and I have discovered and what we understand is, no, it's not capitalism. No, it's not free market. No, it's not the best rise to the top, and that we have, in the notion of capitalism, that if you fail either by doing stupid decisions or by breaking law, that you go away. No, in fact, we found out that the contrary is true, that we give you tens of trillions of dollars illegally backdoored based on this infrastructure that we understand based on this global paradigm that further entrenches this monarchical, fascistic, mafiaistic power paradigm to control the masses. And what you and I are trying to get people to understand is that, listen, all y'all, it's a sabotage, but yet we do have the answer if we can press forward and crush the corruption that's crushing us. I think that's a fair assessment. Wouldn't you say, will you carry that forward?
Absolutely. I think there's an absolutely direct, bold, straight line from the coup in Alberta in 1935, where the Rockefellers installed a puppet who made them above the law and gave away the oil, and the 2008 financial crisis in the United States, after trillions in bad loans had been given out to colored people for the first time in history. And what happened was, when Alberta was taken over in 1935, we didn't have any oil, we didn't produce it, and they didn't want us to. The oil sands started production in 1940 during World War II because we thought we needed oil for World War II. It mysteriously burned down in 1941, a couple weeks before Pearl Harbor. And all the workers got taken away to build the Alaska Highway after that, because the U.S. occupied Western Canada within a couple weeks of Pearl Harbor and built the Alaska pipeline and highway and everything, until Alberta did become independent. In the 60s and 70s, under Trudeau, the federal government broke away from the U.S., tried independent development in Alberta. Lougheed, the premier, broke away, tried to develop independently in Alberta. But eventually, and that's the Alberta I grew up in, where we did have the rule of law. It was this tiny little window in all of Alberta's existence. From 71 to 85, there was the rule of law. That's when I grew out. That's the place I grew up in, and it's declined since then. But eventually, the U.S. got control of Alberta and Canada again. And with the invasion of Iraq, on the same day that Iraq was occupied, that's when all the oil in Alberta that had been given away by Ernest Manning to the Americans for free at his house in the 50s, just 175 billion barrels were given away for free. They didn't pay anything. They never did. And so it's pure surplus, pure gravy, profit for them. And on April 9th, 2003, the same day the Marines pulled down Saddam's statue to complete the occupation of Iraq and to keep all that cheap production off the world market, Alberta's 175 billion barrels became proven legal collateral that private banks could create new money out of thin air for the Rockefellers. On April 9th, the Rockefellers had $9 trillion in new legal collateral. They could lend to any Tom, Dick, or Harry, and as soon as they did, money starts rolling in. And within a year, the FBI was warning of endemic mortgage fraud in the U.S., criminal gangs perpetuating massive fraud to get people to take mortgages for some reason. They couldn't get them before, haven't been able to get them since. Alberta is the explanation. That lawlessness, all those rich people, it's not merit-based. The myth helps prop them up as somehow earning their place, but they're criminals. And now that this late in the game, all the masks have been dropped. It's naked across the American government. And it's a horrible time. It's illusion. And things are going to get worse. But the silver lining is it's one giant crime. It can be stopped. And the amount of money we're talking about, all the talk about the economy in the mainstream ignores this shadow, ignores the colonies, ignores the criminal activity that was facilitated in the 60s by the American banks to help finance. All of that has been integrated. All that feeds into the same system. $9 trillion that you stole from Albertans, that gets recycled every few years. It's available over and over. It's an incredible power. And if any of those countries become independent, it's not just a friendly guy trading with someone else instead of you. You're losing a great source of loot. And that's why the threats and the dominance all over the world. But unlike the 70s, when Canada and Alberta broke free, there was no international community to join. There was no Russia or China or BRICS that you could join with, and there was no credible alternative. But there is today. And so the world, this could be avoided. The problem, the root of it all comes back to the kings and queens. There's a small group of people, the law doesn't apply, and they don't care less than anything about the rest of us. Million here, million doesn't bother them in the slightest. Cost of doing business. You try to look good when you can. You put on a little show here and there, but that's beside the facade. When you get down to the kings, these are genocidal, sociopathic, period. Nothing good can possibly come, and that was America's great achievement, that they broke that line, had the rule of law. But there's enormous pressures and temptations to slip back, and America did. And the hour's late today, but the U.S. still has the structure, the potential, and not much choice. This is the end game as far as organized future goes.
Look, I was looking down at my phone because you touched upon a couple of things that I thought was so remarkable. First of all, the shadow power again has always been there, right? Except we had this time period between, even though it just hurts me to think about the FDR being the imperial presidency, exploiting Alberta and the tar sands, and then how that probably worked into what became American empire after we played a huge role, as did Canada, but of course the United States just being the very large situation we are in beating back Nazis and fascism, and on behalf of what would ultimately be described as democracy for the world. But of course there's these elements that have always been there, that have been the power that was always there, right? Which is this monarchical, and I always look back to the 1700s for parallels of this when I think of the imperialist smash and grab ethos, right? That's what imperialism does. All of major imperialistic powers would go into countries that they could exploit leadership to corrupt, to basically turn on the people of those countries and get them in scenarios where they would have to trade in their own currency, to where they would, take payoffs in that currency. They got dependent on that currency almost like a drug, to where they could bankrupt them. And then when they bankrupted them, they would take over all their natural resources. I mean, That was pretty much 1700s global. I mean, 1400s to the 1700s until the American Revolution and, of course, the French Revolution, and these notions of democratic values that go back to the Greek, and before Rome, and then of course transcends into the Magna Carta and yada yada yada. The world history has been, of course, this battle from the beginning of society, right? I mean, this is just the nature of humanity, because we have to work within society to be able to produce that which we can consume so that we don't have to do it on our own, right? And so there's always going to be a maelstrom of power and control and how it works. And the only thing that can obviously hold power to account is the law, right? And it's again, if you're up to what the legislatures and everybody that through common sense determines, okay, that's theft, that's exploitation, that's against our values, especially after progressive movements and so on and so forth. And you get to this time period where Make America Great Again is going back to this idea of the 50s, just in terms of culturally, right? White male dominance, supposedly bringing back manufacturing to the United States. Good luck with that. The tariffs are to backdoor payoffs from countries to Trump's pocket. That's what the tariff play is. It's nothing more, nothing less. But it is a trip to see, for example, mainstream media saying, well, the tariffs may be working in certain composites. It's like we have globalism, but it's not shared prosperity. What it is exploitation for the few at the expense of the many, right? And so for me, and you and I have discussed this, I think a lot of people would probably presume that you guys sound like a couple of communists, but we're not. What we are is free market people that want competition in the markets based on the accountability of the law, so that there's a playing field, so that people can create mobility, see a need, fill a need, innovate, all of those types of things. That's where you and I come down. So I'm going to give you the last, let's say third of this, to just take us through that as a construct to begin with. That really what we both understand is the perverse inverse of the propaganda from the system that proclaims free markets and abundance and, mobility that's become literally slavery, debt patronage, what it always has been, right? Going back thousands of years. But the missing ingredient is that they can sustain themselves through fiat currency, through the global dominance of the dollar hegemony, until, like you said, BRICS is about to break away, right? And what that might look like, because when crime and tyranny reign supreme, the only way to combat that is with revolution. Throughout history, has there ever been any other way? Not really. And so, I don't know, man. I'm just saying that until and unless people understand that they're being raped and pillaged, like they're, set up in the predation of a Jeffrey Epstein, rape apocalypse, and that they're stuck until they're not. You follow what I'm saying? Can you carry that
Absolutely.
analogy forward?
Well, what we've lost sight of is imperialism. 300 years ago, there wasn't any mysteries. It was bald-faced violence and looting. It was very straightforward. But 100 years ago, it got sophisticated. After the U.S. wasn't terribly imperial before 1890 because there was no need. You had an entire continent to capture. You didn't have to cross an ocean or invade a foreign country. The imperial expansion took place all that time, same, but it was internal. And in 1890, they were forced to make the choice. Do we stay in these boundaries and rationalize the economy and make the best for everybody, or do we just keep going? We keep it unequal, we keep stealing and robbing and go international, and that's the choice that was made. But they did it more sophisticated. The new imperialism talks about development, helping out countries, educating them, developing them. It was liberal. And that's another word. That's, in a lot of ways, that's another word for imperialist. This liberal imperialism had this facade. And that's the secret, that it's not bald face. It never will be. They'll never admit it, but it's just below the surface. There's always a cover story. There's always a narrative on the surface, always. And you always have to it's just below the surface and as real as can be. but the facade is enough to obscure things, to buy time, to confuse enough people in a democracy. And the key to this new imperialism is banking. And the way to steal people is not to hit them over the head and steal their stuff, is to enter into long-term relationships where you help them develop. And there's money flowing and things are, and you can call it all sorts of things, but here in Alberta, what it's meant is trillions of dollars have been siphoned out of by Canadian banks, actually British banks, Imperial Bank, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, the Royal Bank of Canada. These are the world's largest funders of fossil fuels because they were given away by a Canadian puppet to the Americans for free, who then take this collateral they never paid for to Canadian banks, who print trillions of dollars out of thin air and hand it to the Americans, who say, thank you very much. And tomorrow, Albertans dig up more oil and pay back the banks for those Americans. You take the oil, you don't pay for it the first time. It comes across the border, and then you borrow trillions of dollars against those reserves you never paid for. And that also flows to you. We're being robbed $2 for every dollar of oil taken. That's modern imperialism. That's how the real world works. That the savings and loan debacle were the first glimpses of that. Oil wasn't collateral. It was, since the 1930s, you couldn't use it to borrow money. It's too dangerous, too stupid. Crooks and crooks put them together, it's bad news. But starting after 1971, when the US lost Alberta, when we became independent, where are you going to get your money? They had to turn to crime, organized crime, starting in Texas and Chicago and California where there was oil. So you could play games with oil and start robbing people. And they built up a system. They tore down the system that brought down the savings and loan, but that's all it did. That was the last thing the American judicial system ever did along these lines. And eventually they recaptured control of Alberta in 1992. They reinstalled another puppet after the war, and carry on, gets you to 2003, gets you to the housing crisis. This is the world, bald-faced, straight, how it operates, but it's just below the surface. And there's a narrative, and there's a big, loud industry of distractions and bells and whistles. And if you don't know enough, it all sounds good. But with a bigger perspective, you can see clearly the bankers and imperialists are playing the old king's game of robbing everybody, killing whoever. There's no, and that's what's so discombobulating to everybody is they will never say it. It is just below the surface.
It's never been more clear to more people because of Epstein, because that's the thing, right? Because they're only seeing this much of it, but they're seeing, hey, wait a second, elites can get away with raping, children, and there's no law to hold them accountable. They can see that. But what we're talking about is that infinitum, right? They can rape cultures. It's imperialist exploitation that's backstopped by a currency domination. Go ahead.
Epstein is what they do in their spare time. As imperialists, they travel, they rob these guys, and that's just the grave. And it's the entry fee. You want to be a part of the game, you want to be a part of the mob, you got to be a made man. They don't let anybody in. And when it comes to imperial politics, they don't let anybody in. One honest person would they're not, you have to enthusiastically sign up. Yes, pose for pictures with Epstein. These aren't stupid people. They're willing, and these aren't covert pictures. They know what they're doing. They're not ashamed. It's old news, but that's the cost of entrance.
That was a fantastic point, and because unfortunately we're going to do this once a week. We got more to do, and tell us. Let me make this point, and then I want you to tell us where we can find further writings, and I'll post below, and we'll designate a specific day of a week so we can do this every week because it's getting more and more important, especially that last point that you made. But I think I want to make this point was that the irony, right, is here I am. The clean New Deal, right? And so we're talking about, my friends, through a whole a myriad of layers to understand the exploitation through dirty fuels that are literally pollution, right? But this is all a metaphor too for the pollution of our system, of the pollution of truth, of the pollution of common sense, of variables that can create a competitive but fair marketplace where people have the freedom and liberty to go as far as they can, but at the same time while not destroying everybody in its wake because of the cost of admission of what Reagan had just pointed out so brilliantly. And so, I want to just pause to get people to understand that please check out the con.tv, which is the blueprint for how, the CEO perverse incentives lead to this calculus of roofing and raping through the form of, I would say, just absolute predation. It's not capitalism, again, because capitalism even says in its definition, literally, it's risk reward. There's no risk in this system that we have for those that are part of that tiny club. They're guaranteed, which some people might call socialism. It's really just criminality. It's corporate fascism. Fascism can only exist if the law doesn't exist, unless, of course, you make laws that one group of people is going to have all the control and everybody else is basically in some dire straits, right? So we're supposedly anti-fascist as a democratic nation, and what we're trying to imbue in people who watch this, and hopefully you'll like and share and subscribe and get involved and everything else, because from where I'm sitting, guys, it's the end of the road. Maybe it's population wise, maybe it's the fact that it's going to be the end of the road for a large percentage of the population, in my opinion, one way or the other, either through a dramatic, massive global contagion of something, whether it's war or downturn or some sort of modern day plague. I don't know what in the form of what that might be, but I believe that the power structure has demonstrated from 9/11 through the 2008 great financial crisis and everything that's come since, like Reagan had also verbalized, that they don't give a flying fuck. Who's they? The people in this little bubble. Millions of people are expendable. What I continue to say is we're not expendable. The system of corruption and pollution of fascism is expendable. If millions of us of good conscience, of good integrity, of courage, in the notion of freedom and liberty and justice for all, do what we're pledged to do, that we're not doing because we're in the dark, man. So, tell us where we can find your stuff and give us a closing comment, my friend.
Well, a lot of my essays are on a York University website called Capital is Power. Some political economy professors in Toronto there have provided a platform for a lot of my work, and Canada Files, an independent foreign policy news organization covering Canadian foreign policy, something that I've studied for a long time, has also published a number of my essays. And I think our message has incredible resonance with the American people. That it's not us, we're not communists. It's capital. There's the difference between capitalism and imperialism. That's what we're calling imperialist capitalists. That's not what they're doing. As Bill Black says, the only sure thing is fraud. They're the benefactors of a sure thing. They're not competing. They're imperialists. And the principles that would bring them back to earth, to be just one of the rest of us, those are universal in America. The reason the media is so tightly controlled and so tightly important is because these ideas are terribly dangerous and terribly popular and resonate with everybody not in on the take. Everybody who isn't part of the king and his friends in these financial crimes going on is the victim. And the amount of money this tiny group of people is stealing is also more than enough to solve our problems. That's the scale of these crimes and the scale of their of public resources, that when these criminals are subjected to the rule of law, has all sorts of benefits, but the biggest one is we get the money back. 5 million Albertans, we have trillions of dollars again. Well, it's a different world. We have all opportunities, potential we don't as a colony, and we never will have. And so I've spent the last 10 or 15 years in a colony, butting my head against the wall. It doesn't work. Everything's a dead end. And now Americans are seeing the same thing at home, that the masks are falling, the clock has run out. Nobody has any space left to pretend. Trump is not. All the best they have is distractions. And there's a big industry to help sell fake explanations for this. We have a very solidly grounded, historically, the experts, something real. There's all sorts of alternative stories to confuse and waste time until it's inevitable. But time is the key. We're running out of it. And if people get a glimpse of that and the fact that there's a solution, it isn't so dark. Uh, but there's a lot of false, it's confusing and changing. There's a lot of false narratives trying to encourage that. But Patrick and the con have cut through that. And that's helped me cut through what's going on here and how it ties together, and has revealed a solution that it isn't a mystery. It isn't unknowable. It isn't unsolvable. Uh, it's very real. But the amount of money being misappropriated is enough to solve our problems, to have a decent society, to have a sustainable future. That's all well within our grasp, but only with the rule of law, not under a dictator, but popular democracy and the rule of law. And those ideas, we don't have to do the work. We don't have to convince people. They just have to have a clear idea, those principles. And that's the other thing about the rule of law. It allows you to maintain principles. That's the other thing about this imperial world. There's no principle. No matter how many decades they proclaimed anything, dropped like a hat. Like your trading partners, like Germany, you just friends. None of that exists without the rule of law. You can't have the principles that protect people, that make a decent society, something to be proud of, to make something better than there was. You can't have any of that without the rule of law. And so things are things are wild these days, but within that, there's incredible potential. It's not too late. And as few people know about this stuff, the the seeds are ripe. It's There's so much potential there just under the surface. There always was, but with the mask coming off and things getting ugly, more and more people are starting to see, and it's going to be a race between which narrative replaces it. I know there's a lot of right wing, fanciful stories trying to explain all this away, and they have a funny way of coming back to incredibly sympathetic narratives for Trump today. But the truth and the clarity from the con of what actually happened, what's actually going on, does still point to a clear path to a solution. We can pay for it. It's not too late. But that's the imperialist goal, is to confuse us and distract us until it's too late, until it's inevitable. And that's exactly what American intelligence did with Europe in the 50s and 60s, creating the European Union to integrate them with NATO. They lied about it, financed everything, were behind the scenes, and their whole point from their internal documents was to push the debate past the point of inevitability, not to let them know what we're up to until it's too late, and they were successful. And it seemed like they were friends and trading partners, but now the masks are off, the tariffs are up, and they're not your friends. And Canada's finding that out too. We're not your friends, Trump's friends, but there is the potential for that. We glimpsed that before, so we know it's real. And that's what gives me hope going forward, that it's not too late and the solutions can still be paid for if we had the rule of law.
Well, that reminds me of everything that, I'm in the midst of with the Clean New Deal and the platform, because I'm always reminded when we have these discussions and in other discussions that I have of the great prophet David Byrne, same as it ever was, right? I mean, I consider this pernicious power grab of tyranny behind the scenes to complicity and duplicity and, quite frankly, evil. And by the way, I was going to quote this because it was funny that this film that I watched last night with my son, coming from this really interesting, quirky production company out of New York called A24. They shot this up in Canada, or at least that was the location. It's called Death of a Unicorn. Okay, and it was really this composite of this sort of Machiavellian horrific construct of complicity and power and development, within the context of the unicorn, which is the truth. Really, in what they would do, they have to murder the truth over and over for them to survive. And what we're talking about is that, as Bill Black says every week in my work with the new Untouchables, is that this entire system depends on lies. And it's so easy to obliterate those lies. But what's insane is when you have a media that hyper constructs on this to take you away from everything we're talking about. That's when the psychology of this misdirectional tactics and confusion, and when you're on your heels, you can't fight. And what the Clean New Deal is to put you on your toes to fight forward, which is exactly, the liberation for, for Reagan, with everything that his construct reveals against tyranny, is to me the ultimate, at least what I was taught, the American DNA against the tyranny, right? That's our whole construct. And here I am 248 years later with the Clean New Deal, with the most important part by way of the money. Because I've always thought that if your principles aren't in alignment with your actions, you're in disarray. Well, that's why we're in absolute chaos. But if you have the truth, you live in light. If you live in a lie, you're depraved. If you have the truth, you're bulletproof. If you live a lie inside, you die. That's what we're in the midst of, is a rotting, decaying society of the bloated, dead whale carcass of the American dream, where we have, literally, because of what we're seeing with all things Trump, just carnies, right? They're pimps, whores, junkies, and parasites. They're feeding on the dead whale carcass of the American dream, i.e. death of a unicorn. Okay, I highly encourage everybody to check this out on HBO, because it's parallel to what we're talking about. And ultimately, as it relates to the money, what I'm revealing, and Regan can verify, and others that are in the context, that I'm the only person in the world that has been saying this for now years, that Federal Reserve Act 13.3 was used illegally to backdoor tens of trillions of dollars, $71 trillion to date between 2009 and 2019. There are many trillions more that have happened afterwards for a variety of reasons. So it spanned 3 administrations. And I guarantee more to come if we don't get a handle on this, because the way the construct of the exigent lending of the Federal Reserve is not to guarantee racketeering, which would be ridiculous. And it's actually in the statutes, but nobody asked the question and nobody stopped it, except for, I found it through MMT economists that revealed it through the Levy study and so forth, because I found MMT was speaking to me and I was like, well, wait a second. You mean it's MMT for criminals? We're providing tens of trillions of dollars with the full faith and credit of the United States on this global, in terms of lending capacity. And that's another conversation that we'll have later. But is there anything I just said that doesn't resonate with you? Is there anything I said that you would take umbrage with?
Absolutely not. I think 13.3 is the imperial seed planted in America that eventually got you to where you were. It was never used for 90 years until you had control of Alberta, but that was the seed that is now in full bloom, and it's time to cut down the tree.
That's right. Because it's a seed of corruption and deception, man. And this is the same story every civilization has had to fight from the beginning of time. Go ahead.
The rest of us have to pay that back. That 13.3 creates all that money and puts it. The rest of us have to pay it back. That's the free lunch. That's the new imperialism, the financial gravy train. They tell you, economists never tire of telling you there's no free lunch. There's no free lunch. That's because there's a free lunch.
Yeah, and all these hypocrites within MAGA, they're like, okay, we've got to get control to drain the swamp, and then we're going to get rid of the national debt. It's up to 37 trillion. Meanwhile, I like to point out to American consumers, 33 trillion in debt. And ultimately, then what did Trump do? Because the big beautiful bill adds another $3.5 to $5 trillion to the national debt. Go ahead.
Let me throw in one last disturbing thing from all the time I've seen America operating in Canada. Elections are dangerous times. You never know what's going to happen unless you got both sides, the Republicans and the Democrats, or whatever we have here, unless you have them both. And if it is the end of the line and all the masks are dropped, then now you have Trump, imperialist wet dream for a president. They couldn't have genetically modified someone to be so perfect.
The stupid whisperer, exactly. The
And
trans.
so, what I think all this Epstein stuff could be is his retirement plan. The best way for these evil elements to maintain this control they have under Trump past the next election is to get rid of him before, which they often do here in Canada. They'll have somebody resign right before an election. So it's really only a one-sided election. If you remove Trump early, you get a chance to replace him with the next guy. And so all of this, and hey, Trump would love to just go back to the golf course as a hero, would drag down whatever. He wouldn't mind, better than getting shot again. And so I think part of what Americans should be worried about is an early regime change and facilitation of avoiding that next election. If this is the end of the game, you're going to have to think really hard about getting a next election. And Epstein, the timing of it is an exit route for him. And to throw into this, are we really going to have another election this soon, or it's someone else? It's a disturbing potential, which we've seen many, many times. Our prime minister just resigned before the last election, before we just installed the central banker, many, many times here. And so that's one of the dynamics that might help explain the circus and the chaos that will end up benefiting these same characters going forward. It wouldn't be a victory to bring them down.
I'm gonna just say this out loud, and it's gonna be my closing comment because I got a split. But dude, the precepts of the Clean New Deal are this, and folks, I had actually projected and prognosticated and tried to get people to understand before the actual re-election, stolen election of Trump and MAGA and the tyranny to come and the fascism and all of those types of things. Which it's just it's even worse than I expected, right? It's a little even worse. But I had projected because of the Clean New Deal that, and this is before, and I've attended the No Kings rallies and the 50501 rallies all summer long. I've been very much a part of it. I've spoken, I've engaged, I've delivered the message to 10,000 people in person, and hopefully millions more. But I know I'm quashed by the Borg, so to speak. But people, you have to understand, based on this entire conversation, in the Clean New Deal, you'll find the solution. We got to get millions of people to go demonstrate in Washington, D.C. peacefully, but we have to surround the corruption of Congress, the presidency, the White House, the Federal Reserve, the DOJ, the FBI, the SEC, and the Federal Reserve. Honestly, all of those institutions and the centrifugal force of this power of corruption that's on a global tyranny at the moment, that I can't believe we, the American people, have allowed that to happen, because they keep pissing on our head, telling us it's rain, to these diabolical, maneuverings, which are just absolutely insane, especially when you add on the ban and flood the zone strategy. When people are just trying to contend with the four walls of survival, right? We've got to come out of our cocoons. We've got to join hands with the truth to elevate it. We're millions of us, and we know what'll happen next summer if we do this, right? And I said, we have to get millions. There's going to be martial law that's coming if we have maybe a tiny shred of getting free and fair elections in the midterms in 2026, even though we know the Republicans are doing everything they can to gerrymander the hell out of specific states that are going to swing the election in terms of, the representation and so forth, to thwart any sort of, pushback against all things Trump in the first 2 years, right? Which, if we don't do it now, we're not going to be able to do it for probably decades after, if not generations later. I have no idea what happens if we don't rise to the moment now. But what I've said is we have to get millions of people to DC to demonstrate, where everybody in America is like, we know exactly who did what, when, and how. We know exactly how the system is lying to us, how the system has perverted everything to create this corporate fascist system that's undergirded by a mafiocracy that's fueling fascism, that's guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the United States. It's absolutely insane. So we're going to exodus, liberate ourselves, and hopefully our Canadian friends will join us in this march to the National Mall, where underneath the gaze of Abraham Lincoln, he said, "A government for the people shall not perish from this earth." Across from the reflecting pond from Martin Luther King, who said, "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice," right? We have to be the living embodiment of those ethos, those principles, so that we can deliver the following precepts. We got to get a new Glass-Steagall that prevents Wall Street from stealing from all over the world and being backstopped by really the bones of America. That's what that's what this is coming down to, and that's exactly what Reagan just said. How do you do that? The flip side of it is you cannot have legalized corruption in the form of Citizens United. But here's a key consideration, my friends. You have to understand the perversion of power. We've got to end qualified immunity. No police officer should be able to kill with impunity and not be held accountable if there were suspect circumstances. It's fucking insane. Like I would have been for cops shooting to kill on the insurrection on January 6th, but not black guys that are running away because somebody planted drugs in their car, sort of thing. Those things have to be sussed out in the court. Two, you got to get rid of judicial immunity. You can't have Clarence Thomas and Alito and so on and so forth getting backdoored millions of dollars to the Supreme Court to basically rule for fascism. That's insane. That's not what the founders had intended. And so they have to be held accountable. So no judicial immunity and no presidential immunity. There's no king. There's no unitary presidency. There's no presidential immunity. Are you kidding me? Only in a nation of people that are so befuddled by all this other stuff would someone actually think that's okay. Millions of us have to come to the fore to be able to say, no way, not now, not on our watch. We don't care what happens. That's not going any further. And then the line in the sand, I think now with 370 million people in the United States, the Electoral College has long lost its utility because of the perversion of the gerrymandering and the billionaires that control the system. And if you disagree with that, you're against liberty and justice for all. You're against the integrity of the law. You're against principles. You're against, quite frankly, the truth. And if you are that, well, hey, good luck to you. But the rest of us have to rise and we have to get there. Are you down with that, my friend?
Absolutely. The two missing ingredients are integrity and good faith. Don't exist amongst the elite. And they're available in spades amongst those hundreds of millions of citizens. And that's who the system should represent.
The greatest opportunity in history is happening because you cannot avoid the absolute insanity, the calamity of this deception, corruption, and quite frankly, as delivered through incompetence. This stuff is so obvious now. Everything that Reagan and I have been talking about a lot of times has been obfuscated in mystery. Now it's absolutely clear. You cannot ignore what we're saying. Dive in, understand what we're delivering you. And Reagan, I'll reach out to you next week and I'll bid you adieu for the weekend. Thank you for joining me.
Take care.
All the best, my friend.